What up, Wizards? It's Dev. Mtg, we like it a magic, and we have got the top 3 decks of the week for you again here. But let me clear up some real quick confusion that I keep seeing in the comments section as far as what top 3 decks of the week means. Not the absolute strongest, everybody knows they exist, S-tier decks in the format. That's not what we're covering. I would rather not talk about Esper or Traxaram for the 1000th time. What I'd much rather do is talk about cool decks that came out of nowhere. Nobody's playing them except for like 1 or 2 very, very smart people, and they were able to break through the meta and all get very good finishes or results in various leagues or tournaments over the past week or 2. Again, I would much rather do that than talk about the S-tier decks in this format for the 1000th time. Let's talk about decks you haven't heard of, as opposed to the boring ones you have. So that's my entire intro. I don't want to waste too much time because I already spent like 30 minutes worth of video talking about all the decks, and I can't really devote too much time to intros. But let's go ahead and jump into it here with a little bit of full disclosure, preparing you a little bit. This is going to be the only deck we look at this week with a white background. It is our honorable mention. I know it says top 3. We're going to look at 4 decks today. That's what honorable mentions are for. But I did want to cover the fact that this deck just 5-0'd a league, which isn't the most important result in the world, I'll be the first to admit. But when a deck 5-0's a league, I at least want to bring it up if it's a deck that we have not seen in forever. So that is the case with today's first deck, Mardu Vampires. Now let me make my face much, much smaller because people complained about that last time, and I can see why. You'd rather see the cards in my face. So my face is not that much to look at, but the cards, that's important. So Mardu Vampires, actually a deck. 5-0'd a league. Who did it? Chiellini. Good job. Congratulations to them. Because it's not every day that you see Vampires 5-0 a league. It's been quite some time. And there are some new-ish cards in here. There's nothing brand new from Wild's Eldraine, at least. Not that I'm seeing off the top of my head, but there are new-ish cards that hadn't really gotten a chance to shine in Vampires yet, right? I mean, you got your usual suspects, your Vampire Socialite, kind of half of an Anthem effect, I like to call it. Florian to help you draw cards. Enrica Domnathi draws cards, removes creatures. Voldaren Epicure, great 1-drop. Anya, just a single copy of this, helps you get that reach in the late game, blow up the blood tokens of the creatures, and just like dome your opponent. We got Bloodtithe Harvester, best Vampire in Standard. Edgar Charm Groom, this is yet another like Vampire Anthem effect, but the deck has even more because it gets to play Markov Baron from Aftermath, a super sweet card that has not really gotten to see a whole lot of play in Standard yet. But there's also Dusk Legion Duelist. There aren't a ton of ways to put +1/+1 counters on this in this deck. I'm not going to lie to you. But when you do put +1/+1 counters on it, you draw cards in your aggro deck, and that is worth splashing white for. There's also Voldaren Thrillseeker in here. This, especially with all your Anthem effects, sometimes one of your vampires or multiple of your vampires get really, really big, and you can just apparently just basically fling one of them at your opponent to, again, get that late game reach that a deck like this sometimes needs. You know, again, Anya can do that. There are ways that Enrica Domnathi can do that as well, especially once she flips over and she's got the flying and stuff. Lots of like little bits of reach in this deck, and aggro really needs that in this format right now. So it's good to see. You got your Go for the Throat and your Pile-On for some like decent removal in the deck. There are some other white cards like scattered throughout, like Lorn of the Third Path is in the sideboard. Not a vampire, but very important card to have access to. So I don't want to spend too long on Vampires because we all basically know how this deck is built at this point. But again, when a deck like this just straight up like creature type matters, you know, just really haven't seen a deck like this be important other than like maybe Soldiers in a good long time here. So I just wanted to point this out. You can 5-0 a Standard league with Mardu Vampires right now. All right, now that's done. Let's move into the actual list here, and I might spend a little bit more time talking about these decks because these are decks you're not very likely to have seen up to this point in Standard. Now, this is a deck that's been doing a little bit of work here and there, but it is still very, very much on the fringes. I've tried out my own version of it. I've got it built on Arena right now, and I gotta say, little impressive some of the stuff this thing can do, man. This is Boros Convoke. This version was built by Andres Blue Robot Monsalve for the Pizza Box Open with about 138 different competitors. This was able to manage a 6-1 record. 6 wins, a single loss in this over 100 person event. So fairly cool. And let's look at what this deck is actually trying to do here. Imadane's Recruiter is the most important card in the deck. Amazingly. Somehow. Imidane's Recruiter, if you haven't seen this yet, it's a 3 mana, 2 and a red for a 2/2 human knight. When it ETBs, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. It also has this adventure that creates two 2/2 guys for 5 mana, but as I've been playing this deck, I barely ever use that mode. Even if I have the mana to do it, I barely ever use that mode, because you almost always want, you know, the body half of it. You want your dudes to get +1/+0, gain haste till end of turn. It feels very good a lot of the time. It's odd that this does like a reckless bushwhacker impression in the goblins deck or whatever, because we are going to be boosting goblins with it a good amount of the time, because we play Gleeful Demolition in our deck. A single red mana for a sorcery destroys an artifact. If you controlled that artifact, you get 3/1/1 Phyrexian goblin creature tokens. So the idea here is to play like Voldar and Epicure on turn 1, get the blood token, and then on turn 2, Gleeful Demolition it away. You can also do cool stuff like play Skrelv on turn 1, tap it to like give something protection or make something unblockable, whatever. In that same turn, you can Gleeful Demolition the Skrelv away and then maybe play the other Skrelv from your hand, because legend rule and all that. So that seems pretty sweet, right? You got Yoshin Frontliner in this deck as well. This is only a single mana, and if you Gleeful Demolition it away, you can just unearth it for a turn later and give something +1/+1, and it gets to attack. It benefits from Imidane's Recruiter coming down and stuff. Just such a sweet little deck, dude. And to cap it all off, you got Raging Battle Mouse in here too. This is super sweet for a couple of reasons. Now, obviously, this deck is really, really low curve. It allows you to do things like turn 2 Raging Battle Mouse. Turn 3, you'll end up being able to play Imidane's Recruiter and another creature some of the time. Like you'll play Voldar and Epicure, say, on turn 3. Well, now your Imidane's Recruiter costs 2 to cast. So you get it down, you can swing with the Epicure, you're feeling really good. So something gets +1/+1 till end of turn, because that's the mouse's other ability. But the other cool thing about this in the deck is that you can say Battle Mouse on turn 2 and then Yoshin Frontliner for free, which is sick. Just Yoshin Frontliner equals 0 to cast. For that matter, I'm surprised that I don't see anything like, say, Ginger Brute in here. Doesn't have to be, but I built a couple of these kind of Borosy or mono red, Raging Battle Mouse decks. And I find that Ginger Brute is really good in those. And it would also be a good, sack to Gleeful Demolition. You're an aggro deck. It has haste. So, I think Frontliner is probably the better card altogether if you're looking for like a 1-drop, but there are other options. You got things like Iron Apprentice, which is a single mana for a 1/1 that gets a +1/+1 counter when it comes into play. When it dies, something else gets its counter. That seems decent with Gleeful Demolition, right? And even like Eater of Virtue seems like a halfway decent, like 1-drop artifact in this deck. So there's a bunch of different options if you want something to play for free on turn 2 with Raging Battle Mouse. And I'm pretty sure there's going to be some, build or another out there that can leverage this card in kind of a almost all artifacts build. I've been interested in this card, especially since realizing that you basically get free artifact creatures on turn 2 with it. That's pretty sexy. But aside from that, you've got Resolute Reinforcements, just more board presence for when the Recruiter does come down. You've got Knight Errant of Eos. I'm not playing 4 copies of this, but you don't care what I'm doing. You care what this dude did. That was 6-1 in a big old event, right? I've seen this card in versions of this deck before, and I get it. You've got a bunch of tokens. You can easily convoke it out relatively early, and it's going to draw you some cards. Deck needs all of that, so I don't blame them playing it. Some of these versions of the deck, or some builds, you'll end up seeing like 1 or 2 Regal Bunnycorn. Andres went all the way, just all 4 copies of Bunnycorn. There's also 4 Charming Scoundrel in the deck, a haste creature that's sometimes relatively decent on turn 2, but this also creates a treasure token that can ramp you, or you can sack it to Gleeful Demolition. Just very, very sweet. You can also like turn 2 Scoundrel, get your treasure token, and then turn 3, you have extra mana. So you can like Imidane's Recruiter and again, another creature, right? So you want to play the other creature first and then pop the treasure to play your Imidane's Recruiter. You can also Charming Scoundrel on turn 2 into Charming Scoundrel on turn 3 into Imidane's Recruiter and other stuff. Really, really gross lines there. So a lot of amazing like early game options for a deck like this. But the basic 2, important cards are Recruiter and Gleeful Demolition. And then a lot of the other cards in the deck are basically, put in the deck because they work with these 2 cards. Raging Battle Mouse is also maybe the number 3, like most important card in the deck, right? But honestly, this deck is way, way more than the sum of its parts. It looks really dinky, okay, on paper, and I completely understand that. It looks like a streamer deck and all that, but you have to try this thing to actually believe it. You don't even have to have all 4 Night Heiress. You don't have to have all 4 Regal Bunnycorn. You don't have to have all 4 Charming Scoundrel. There's plenty of other stuff you can throw in this deck. Experimental Synthesizer is another one if you want like a cheap artifact to sack to Lethal Demolition. There's all kinds of stuff that you can do and all kinds of ways you can build this deck. So give this a shot. It's actually really, really budget to build this thing right now. And it's pretty rewarding too. So just wanted to shout this deck out. It's been on the fringes of standard all season, but to see it get a real result like this, very heartening. But deck number 2 here, let's take a look at a deck by someone that I know fairly well. The name is extremely familiar to me because they're actually one of my biggest fans. And I'm trying not to be like super biased here, but one of my just biggest supporters, always on the stream, talking to him on Twitter, you know, Patreon supporter, all that stuff, is OKI Scoop, who I will always call Okie Scoop. We have an understanding. I've called them Okie Scoop for like 6 months, and then I realized, oh, your name is Okay I Scoop. I'm an idiot. So their actual name is that, but I just call them Okie, man. And they went with a deck that I am known for loving, and they ended up getting 5-2 in the same tournament. 5-2 in a 138-person tournament is a pretty respectable result, so congratulations, Okie, for this pretty incredible finish with a deck that you all know I like a lot. So in case you haven't noticed yet, this is the Urborg Lurgoyf deck, aka the Old Stick Fingers deck, aka the Cruel Somnification deck. All of these creatures are very, very similar. They get power equal to the number of creatures in the graveyards. You know, Stick Fingers cares about your graveyard. Urborg Lurgoyf, that cares about your graveyard. So do keep that in mind, but Cruel Somniphage cares about all the creatures in all the graveyards, which I actually think is a neat little piece of the puzzle here. But this was also a reason to just completely devote the deck to Sultai, bite the bullet, and just make it a Sultai deck. You know, Urborg Lurgoyf already has like a blue kicker, but I've always been a proponent of the idea that you don't even need blue in your deck to make Stick Fingers like, or not Stick Fingers, but Lurgoyf halfway decent. But now that Cruel Somniphage is out, I do think you really should start adding them blue sources, right? But now you get to play 10 different creatures that care about how many creatures are in the graveyard. That is amazing. Between Somniphage, Stick Fingers, and Urborg Lurgoyf, and only 2 of those are even legendary. So this deck has been pretty impressive. I play it more or less every season, and I thought that I was losing my mind. Like, is this deck better than it has been in a while? Why am I having better results with this deck now? And this kind of proves proof of concept, you know, slightly. Thanks, Okie, for doing it. Taking it to a real tournament and doing stuff with it. And you built the deck in some ways the exact way I would build it, and in other ways you've included some pretty interesting tech that I do want to talk about. Now, Skyfisher Spider is a card that I've been pretty no bones about liking since the moment I saw it during spoiler season. I'm glad that we see it here. This deck needs a critical mass of creatures to put into the graveyard, right? So this is not like it's a body that is also a removal spell, and we need those. It's also a body that's a removal spell that allows you to put another creature in your graveyard, which this deck wants too. So just a perfect card for this deck. The removal is unconditional. It's destroy target non-land permanent when you sack a creature, which is unbelievable. And this can actually lead to a relatively large life gain once it does die. And nobody knows it's going to do that, in my experience. You know, nobody has read the card that far. They just all know it's a removal piece and it has reach. But it seems like there are a lot of opponents who will just scoop after you gain 12 life off of this because they forgot it did that. So just a sweet little card there. Tenacious Underdog is in here too. Obviously, it's a self-mill deck. So sweet little card to have access to. Tyvar, all 4 Tyvar. So cool. So cool. There is not that much for this first ability to really do, the passive ability in this deck, but that's fine. Totally fine. It's just got this -2, mill 3 cards, return a creature card, mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. That is every single one of our important, you know, creatures in this deck is mana cost 2 or less. So shouldn't be too hard to make Tyvar an awesome card in this thing. And it'll give your Stick Fingers like a pseudo vigilance, so your Lurgoyf like a pseudo vigilance, and they do not want to be swinging into it. I promise you, they do not want to be swinging into like a 7/8 Goyf on turn 4. Not what they want. So most of the time. We also have stuff in here like Blanchwood Prowler to self-mill us and get our land drops. Gnawing Vermin to self-mill us and be a pseudo removal piece. If you remember how annoying it was to attack into a Shambling Ghast in the early game, like a year and a half ago, that should tell you all you need to know about Gnawing Vermin. Sweet card. But the technology in this deck, the new thing that I've never seen before, that I actually think is amazing, is the Huntsman's Redemption. Now, you don't have a ton of non-creature slots in this deck. Note that Oki has not devoted any slots to like go for the throat or right, like non-creature based removal. Removal that is not itself on a creature is what I mean by that. But they did devote 4 slots to the Huntsman's Redemption of all things. Why? Well, this is a saga that makes a 3/3 when it comes into play. It gives you a beast creature token, it's 3 mana. But on chapter 2, you can sack a creature. If you do, search your library for a creature or basic land, reveal it to your hand, shuffle. So it can get you your land drops, but most often it's going to get your stick fingers, your Lurgoyf, your Somnophage. And it's kind of important that it puts it in your hand and not the battlefield, right? If it put it on the battlefield, that would probably be objectively better a lot of the time. But in this case, in this deck specifically, this means that it's in our hand and we can still use Cruel Somnophage's Adventure Hab. We can still pay X for stick fingers. We can still kick Lurgoyf. So we kind of don't mind that it went to our hand, especially considering we have all of our mana untapped once this saga goes off chapter 2. Also importantly, we sacked a creature. So unless we sacked the token that it gave us on chapter 1, we put a creature into our graveyard to increase the stats of our big guys. That's cool. But most important chapter, I think, chapter 3. Up to 2 target creatures each get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. Read that as the game ends. If they don't have removal for both guys, and you've got a stick fingers and a Somnophage, or you've got 2 Lurgoyfs, or whatever combination of 2 guys you have, and most of the time I'm pretty sure you just need 1 guy, right? But if you do have 2 Lurgoyf creatures of some kind out, then suddenly they're going to be like 11/11 tramples till end of turn and you win the game. Giving one of these huge dudes trample has always been a priority for a deck like this. We've done it with cards like Audacity in the past, but we really didn't want to do that. It's not a great card for a deck like this. It is in like green-white enchantments, but this looks much better. This does way more things this deck wants to do, right? And again, I think that 3rd chapter is just win the game a lot of the time, because there's so many games I play with this deck where it devolves into a pattern of I'm going to attack with my 17 power guy and they chump block it every turn. This makes it where they cannot do that, and that's awesome. So I cannot wait to try this card out in the deck. Thanks, Oki, for the idea. Everybody try this deck. Stick Fingers has been fun for a while now, but I get the feeling. I got a good feeling. This is a good deck right here. So I don't want to gush about it anymore. Let's go ahead and move on to deck number 3. Now, our final deck today is Azorius Midrange. You would not think that I would think that was like the neatest deck of the day, right? And when I clicked on this, I fully expected it to be Soldiers or Control or something like that, but it's not. Very, very far from it, in fact. This is Azorius Midrange by Wohang 20 or 1215, and it was at the Gone TV Cup. This ended up 7-1 and won the entire event. Now, there were only about 40 players at this event, so not super well attended, but 7-1, and this deck has never been seen anywhere before, and it's really, really neat. It's got Combat Thresher in here, which is not the link is broken to this, but this is the 6 mana. I believe it's a 3/3 double strike. When it comes into play, you draw a card, but it's got Prototype. You can play it for 3 mana as a 1/1 double strike. Draw you a card when it comes into play. It's also got Steel Seraph, yet another Prototype card. So why are we doing that? Why are we playing these cards? We've got Autonomous Assembler in here too. What is that about? Well, it's all about Twining Twins and Werefox Bodyguard and Extraordinary Journey. 3 brand new cards that allow this deck to do some really weird stuff. I've been on about Twining Twins since the first time I saw it. By the way, it is not called Twinning Twins. It's called Twining Twins. I just want to everywhere on social media. You know what looks good? Twinning Twins. Well, Twinning Twins isn't a card. Twining Twins is. This is the Sarah Angel at a discount that also just has a blink spell attached to it. So you'd think that'd be a good Magic card, right? So I've seen people do stuff like, say, Touch the Spirit Realm, which this deck also plays, to make these prototype creatures come back into play as the bigger versions of themselves. And yes, that does work in case you've never seen it. If you have a 3-mana Steel Seraph, the prototype version of it out, and you blink it with the Twining Twins or Touch the Spirit Realm, it'll come back into play as that 5/4, which is pretty great. Honestly, they could have gone all the way and made this deck Esper and, played, Flesh Gorger, Phyrexian Flesh Gorger and stuff. But I think this deck probably does work pretty well, just Azorius. You can also, hit your own dudes with Werefox Bodyguard and then sack the Bodyguard, gain 2 life, get your dudes back and they're bigger, like that. Come on, that seems pretty good. You've also got Extraordinary Journey in here, a whole 3 of. Now, this can be like a pseudo removal spell, kind of. This does a whole bunch of stuff. It's kind of a, for now, removal spell, but if you have enough mana, this can also hit one of your own, Combat Threshers or Steel Seraphs or whatever, and then flip it over to where it's, again, the bigger version of itself. It's not just the prototype. So really, really neat, man. Super neat. If you've got extra mana when you play this, you can target, your opponent's creatures. So just really, really sweet. And you get to draw, a bunch of cards, basically. With this, the idea, I think, is to more play them as prototypes early in the game. And then once you have the mana, target 2 of your guys, replay them as the non-prototype versions, draw extra cards, get huge dudes into play, and kind of reset your board in the late game. But leading up to that, you can also kind of soul partition your opponent's creatures. And by the way, the deck does have soul partition in it as well to do all the same stuff. There's Invasion of Gobakhan as well. This keeps your opponent from playing sweepers and stuff like that on the front half. And then once you flip it over, basically gives your aggro dudes indestructible and hexproof till end of turn when you sack it. It also kind of acts as an anthem effect, the Invasion of Gobakhan, because it gives a +1/+1 counter to all your dudes that attacked that turn. So you're going to be doing some attacking. I imagine a Combat Thresher with double strike that's getting through every turn is probably pretty sick once it starts getting counters on it, every turn. So just great. Steel Seraph giving the Combat Thresher flying has always been a pretty sweet thing to be able to do. We are playing things like Fleeting Spirit in this deck. Kind of interesting call there, but a neat card. Is it doing something that I don't know? Exile 3 cards from your graveyard. Gains first strike. Discard a card. Exile Fleeting Spirit. Return to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Just blinking, isn't it? Is it just blinking? Am I crazy? Is this card just blinking? Probably. Anyway, deck is really cool. The main trick we've seen before, but we've never seen it with these new cards, Before, this version of the deck really just had Touch the Spirit Realm and that was it, But now, the redundancies are amazing. You got Touch the Spirit Realm, Twining Twins, and Werefox Bodyguard, and Extraordinary Journey. All from the same set that just made this deck way, way better. Wohing decided hey, that's an interaction I want to try. And it turns out it's a great interaction too. I knew Twining Twins was going to do something. We'll see if it can keep doing this thing, because I think this deck does look pretty solid. One more thing about this deck, I just had to pause to make sure there wasn't an Agatha's Soul Cauldron in the sideboard or something, because Fleeting Spirit might be pretty cool with that. If it works the way I want it to, but I'm still not absolutely sure that it would, right? Because if you were able to exile a Fleeting Spirit with an Agatha's Soul Cauldron, all your dudes with +1/+1 counters, including your prototypes and stuff, would have this discard a card and blink ability, and you could blink them and they would come back as the non-prototype versions of them, which seems kind of cool, but you don't have a Soul Cauldron, so I don't even know what I'm on about. I just wanted to point out that could be an interaction. But anyway, just a cool deck that I wanted to point out, and there were a few cool decks to point out this week, man. And again, people, one last thing, and this is almost the entire point of this series, so I feel like it's a good last thing to say. People despair all the time about Standard, right? Standard's terrible, and it's stale, and it's blah, blah, blah. But I promise you, if you go looking, if you know where to look, just about every week you can find brand new decks that people are really getting results with. So, you don't have to play Esper. You don't have to play Dimir. You don't have to play Mono Red. You don't have to play Soldiers. There's plenty of options out there in Standard right now, and I'm trying to prove it 3 decks at a time with these videos. But I hope you enjoy them. And if you did, leave a like. Subscribe if you haven't done it yet. That would mean a lot to me. We're trying to get 200K. We just need 70,000. That ain't that much. You can check out the Twitch and play some Magic at some point in the next couple of days on that website. So link in the description there. And of course, you can help me out on Patreon if you appreciate all the hard work I'm doing around here. I would really like that. Patreon's basically the only way I actually get paid doing this job, so it means a lot to me when I get Patreon support. But aside from that, I'm basically done. If you have any decks that you want to discuss that you haven't really heard anybody talking about, let us know down there in the comments section. Of course, unless you're holding that technology close to the chest. I understand that, but I'm all ears, man. I want to know what your cool deck ideas are and if you've been doing good with them too. But aside from that, basically donezo for this one, so I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.